So we all know that Omicron is now in the horizon. It is now in the city. We now have the local transmission of this dreaded, highly infectious variant. No one can deny that we are now in the midst of this highly infectious COVID variant. And who knows, we just met or dined with somebody with infection without us knowing it, since majority of cases of Omicron variant infection has been asymptomatic. So what is important is that we don't want someone to spread this infection to anybody, especially those who could get seriously ill or die from it. It is therefore very important that once we have the infection, if we have the symptoms, it is best to stay home and isolate. So what if we get the Omicron disease? What do the guidelines say in terms of what we need to do? And how many days do we need to isolate? Let's watch this. So the truth of the matter is that now with the exponential growth of this COVID-19 infection in our country, it is believed that this is definitely Omicron variant in action. From a mere, let's say, 400 after Christmas to around 1,000, then to 5,000 cases, then to tens of thousands in just one day is really amazingly highly infectious process. In other words, just like in other countries of the world, this growth is definitely out of control. We therefore fear the massive disruption of critical care services, not only in terms of healthcare workers getting infected and sick that needs isolation, but also other services, including schools, now with face-to-face classes being canceled. Likewise, transportation, both land and air, may again be soon disrupted, creating much inconvenience to the many who are using transportation. In other words, we don't want to save lives of the many people, but also we want to think about the massive disruption of the livelihood of the many. So how then, or how bad is Omicron infection? So based on what we know, Omicron is definitely much more infectious compared to Delta, and likewise shortens the time between exposure to symptomatic illness. What is definitely important for all to know is that people infected with Omicron are most infectious just before they develop symptoms or a day or two after getting the infection. So this is where the danger is, because we may be meeting with these infected friends without him or you knowing that, without us knowing that we are being exposed already. But the bad part is that they can then infect others and spread the virus and cause a massive increase in cases. Now, the good news is that on the individual level, if a person is fully vaccinated and boosterized with one dose of booster and gets Omicron, most likely it will be mild, very less likely to cause severe illness. And that is the reason why we need to be vaccinated, requiring hospitalization and of almost similar degree of getting influenza. Now, the main reason why we get vaccinated is we want to avoid developing severe disease, not to be infected. We may get the infection, but we will not progress to a severe pneumonia or death. Now, the severity is indeed much worse for the unvaccinated and children if they have no vaccines yet, if they do get exposed and get ill. So if you look at the graph provided by ICNARC, you need to squint to see the number of fully vaccinated and got boosted who were admitted to the critical care unit requiring ventilation. This graph do provide you evidence that vaccines do really work. Now, with this scenario in mind, and with almost a million cases per day now in the US and thousands of cases in UK and Europe, it is best for us to also adapt to the guidelines in terms of isolation and quarantine with regard to Omicron variant. And since majority of those infected that got vaccinated will be mild and not severe, it is for this reason that the Centers for Disease Control of the United States adopted their guidance to fit these new data and scenarios. So let me simplify what is this worldwide CDC guideline and recommendations if and when we get COVID-19 at this time of Omicron surge, and try to adapt it to your local scenario, as I will also present some of the local DOH guidelines with regard to isolation and quarantine. First, if you get COVID and you are living with someone or your work entails you to be in contact with people considered vulnerable to get serious illness if they get COVID, this includes the elderly and the immunocompromised people, including those in nursing homes, then it is best that you isolate yourself for a total of 10 days. Second, if you get COVID-19 and is severely ill as a result of the infection, and you are immunocompromised state, then again, best to isolate for 10 days, but this may be longer as you may be infectious longer than others. It is also advisable that you seek consult with your primary care physician on the matter when to end your isolation. Third, if you get COVID-19, but you have your own bubble, you have your own groups of people, and those around you are not vulnerable or immunocompromised, and if you are symptomatic, but they are mild or in fact resolving symptoms, then the advice based on the CDC is to stop your isolation after just 5 days. But make sure that if you go out of isolation, you always wear a mask. Plus, it is not advisable for you to be going out to restaurants where you have to remove your mask to eat. This should be done in the remaining 5 days. Now, this is where the guidance became controversial due to the shorter 5-day duration. But people have to understand that the remaining 5 days after isolation still will require that that person should always wear a mask and avoid going out to certain enclosed spaces. Now, this guidance of shortened protocol has not been adopted by the Philippine local authority for the general population. The shortened duration of isolation is only advised for fully vaccinated healthcare workers in consideration of their healthcare capacity. Fourth issue, when do we test? Or do we need to test while in isolation? The simple answer is yes, meaning you could get a test on day 5 of your isolation. And if your antigen test is positive, then it means you need to isolate longer. But as long as you are not with any vulnerable people, you will not be exposing immunocompromised people in your area, then not testing everyone at day 5 is deemed reasonable at this age of Omicron infection. Fifth, the rapid antigen tests, which anybody can do, provided that you do it properly. These are simple home-based tests. They're simple and fast. But remember, these are not perfect tests, as some individuals who test negative may actually be infected and contagious. In short, even if you get a negative result, it doesn't change the need to mask anyway until day 10. Now, these new guidelines don't require testing at the end of isolation because PCR tests for COVID-19 can be positive up to 12 weeks, long after the person is no longer infectious. Likewise, it is not really known yet if antigen testing is good indication of transmissibility at this stage of infection. But what is known is that after 5 days, people are much less likely to transmit the virus, and that masking further reduces the risk. Simply put, the best way to protect everyone is to isolate oneself once you have symptoms, is to quarantine yourself once you're exposed to an infected person, so as not to spread the virus. Isolating for at least 5 days and extending it to 10 days if you are around vulnerable people or seriously ill folks in your environment is pretty reasonable. Our own Department of Health also came out with our own local guidelines. These policies and guidelines on testing, quarantine, and isolation were being updated to reflect the current state of information and therefore achieve a favorable risk-benefit ratio. So for those patients who are asymptomatic with mild to moderate disease, whether fully vaccinated in the general public or healthcare workers, the recommendation for isolation is only 7 days from the onset of symptoms. In contrast, if the patient is partially vaccinated or unvaccinated, a full 10 days of isolation is recommended. Similarly, the same guideline with regard to isolation period is also recommended for patients who are asymptomatic. If you are exposed to a patient with COVID-19, the updated quarantine period for asymptomatic close contact for the general public starting January 13, the updated quarantine period for asymptomatic close contact would now be only 5 days for fully vaccinated and 14 days for partially or vaccinated or the unvaccinated. However, it is recommended that continuous symptom monitoring up to 14 days is recommended. What I would probably recommend is for the remaining 5 days that the patient is off quarantine, that this person should continue to wear mask, specifically if in an enclosed space. So our simple goal here in terms of strict isolation is to protect our vulnerable loved ones and also protect the healthcare workers that their work will not be disrupted so they can still continue to provide the needed healthcare for all. Simply put, when in doubt, my simple advice is for all my patients and friends that if you got exposed or if you have symptoms, to be on the safe side, to be on the side of caution, and simply isolate yourself for the next 10 days. Lastly, we have to remember that 40% of Omicron infection is asymptomatic. And therefore, the best way to survive in this pandemic is to be fully vaccinated and get your booster shots as soon as possible. And always wear your protective gears, especially using the right fitting mask at all times. It is also time to avoid unnecessary trips to crowded places, especially malls, and avoid eating in crowded restaurants with your mask off. I hope this video helps clarify issues when you get Omicron, what to do to isolate or to quarantine when you're exposed. See you again soon.